disc jockey drop the bass. Now the heads.
Howdy, I heard you like videos. If you're not already watching on YouTube, you should toddle on over to YouTube and you should subscribe to Post-Mortem Video, all one word, and you should click subscribe, and you should click the little bell, and you should select all when you click the little bell, and whatever other hoops that YouTube now has you jump through in order to actually be subscribed. Basically, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Hello. I believe I may have stumbled upon something that explains a lot of the conflict in fandoms, in role-playing games, in all kinds of creative enterprises, and that is a disagreement on what suspension of disbelief means, or in gaming terms, which I'm more familiar with, obviously, what you might call immersion, where you become immersed in the fantasy world and you act as your character rather than your player acting as your character. This is, for many people, the goal of role-playing games, for example. Now, I've always believed that the responsibility for creating suspension of disbelief really rests upon the author or the filmmaker or the games master, depending on the medium, to create. So you create a world that is plausible, that is internally consistent, that makes sense, that is grounded. And once you do that, the fantastical elements, when they're brought in, can make sense, and you've already established a certain reality to this secondary world that you're creating. And for me, this is why But My Dragons doesn't really work. Just because of the fact that there are supernatural elements within a world doesn't mean that you have created the required suspension of disbelief for more mundane, historical, or particularly real things. This is why demands for increased multiracial representation in something like Game of Thrones, or increased female representation in the more active and combative characters in Game of Thrones didn't make any sense, wouldn't make any sense within the context of that world and our sort of historical vision of these worlds. There were women that wielded power, there were exceptions like Brienne of Tarth, but that only worked because of the world that had been established, for example. So when you violate something more familiar to people, it throws them out of that sense of immersion. Whereas if you keep everything grounded, then the fantastical elements can more readily be accepted. This has been my view. It's not one of sexism, it's not one of racism, it's one of plausibility and internal consistency. However, I discovered recently that there is an altogether different interpretation of what suspension of disbelief, which you might call willful, I suppose, suspension of disbelief. And this is where the onus is more upon the player or the viewer or the consumer of the entertainment, whatever it might be, deliberately and willfully turning off their critical faculties when it comes to examining the piece of work that they're taking in. You may hear this said of certain cheesy action movies or B-movies or something. Turn your brain off and enjoy. But this is a case of it's so bad it's good, and in part we enjoy these things because they're bad, because they don't make any sense, because they're so laughably awful. And even then, plot holes can still be an annoyance. When we see something that just doesn't make sense up on the screen or on the pages of the book or in the middle of a game, it still niggles and it still throws you out of that enjoyment, save in those very rare instances of so bad it's good. And I think these two competing interpretations of suspension of disbelief, of which only one I was really aware of before, I think they explain why there is such a dichotomy of acceptance of certain entertainments that have been changed and shifted and moved. It's why canon is so important to some people, because that establishes the precedent, the context, and the consistency of the worlds. So when you come in and you completely overthrow all of that, as has happened recently in the Doctor Who franchise, then all of that is lost. Yeah, the onus is then on the viewer to ignore everything that they know about the franchise and how it has worked up until that point, in order to enjoy the new material, which just throws everything out seemingly on an arbitrary whim and doesn't make sense in the context of everything that's gone before. You can see something similar in Star Wars. For some people, this is the creation of an alternative reality that has certain rules and elements and so on that create a sense of plausibility, even though it's more on the fantastical end. And then that has then been overturned with subverted expectations in the newer material. The rules of the world have been violated in a way that throws a whole bunch of people who are heavily invested in the franchise out of their suspension of disbelief. And yet people are supposed to just accept it because space wizards, in this case, rather than just dragons. Again, the emphasis is on the viewer to ignore the context, to ignore the plausibility, to ignore the plot holes, to ignore everything that has gone before in order to accept what is there on the screen now, rather than the emphasis being on the author or the director in this case to create that suspension of disbelief and to operate within the context of what has gone before. In role-playing games, we see a lot of fuss around racial representation. Disabled representation is the one particularly lately, with people wanting wheelchair-accessible dungeons and so on. The flaws in this idea are manifest and obvious. There's no need to rehash them all in particular here. But again, the people objecting are largely objecting not because they hate disabled people or don't want to see disabled people represented, but just because it doesn't make any sense within the context and the established permutations of the world, the internally consistent rules of the world. Whereas the people who want to include this will make the Modragons argument, or representation is more important to them than immersion, than consistency, than plausibility, than all of these other factors that other people are much more invested in. The term suspension of disbelief was coined by Coleridge, though it goes back earlier than him to Aristotle in his examinations of theatre. But in correspondence with Wordsworth, Coleridge put it like this. They were engaged in a sort of conversation and discussion about this. Coleridge said, "It was agreed that my endeavours should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shades of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith." Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. In other words, Coleridge was trying to create an acceptance of supernatural elements within his narratives by creating a sense of plausibility and consistency, while Wordsworth was trying to create a sense of wonder in the mundane and the normal. And as I said, the concept was older, going back to Aristotle and his examinations of theatre, the role of fiction in creating catharsis, but the Coleridge definition is basically how it's been used and how I have thought of it up until relatively recently. From an authorial and gaming perspective, you can look to Tolkien, who had some things to say about this, whose influence on fiction and upon gaming in particular are pretty big and unassailable. Tolkien saw the creation of suspension of disbelief as being to create an entire sort of secondary world that was internally consistent within itself and made sense in and of itself. None of this is to say you can't have massively fantastical worlds and works. They just need to be grounded and consistent in order to carry you along with them. So either the world is grounded and consistent and makes sense to us as people, as you might say of China Mayville's works. They're fantastical, but they're also grounded. The world is gritty and realistic. The relationships between these fantastical elements all make sense on a human level, and so we're willing to suspend our disbelief. Or you can be carried along to it, starting from a mundane point of view and then progressing to a more fantastical point of view, like, say, Big Trouble in Little China, which starts with bets and trucking and a gang fight in Chinatown, and then gradually ramps things up, and before you know it, there are magical duels going on. So I think a lot of this disagreement comes from the divide between those who see suspension of disbelief as arising from the world and the storyteller, as I do, and those who put the onus on the reader or the player or the viewer to deliberately and willfully suspend their critical faculties and to ignore everything that doesn't make sense or isn't internally consistent. And that's where I think a lot of the divide is actually coming from. But it hasn't changed my point of view. Zang.
Tal, friend, and welcome to Gore. Savage and beautiful, John Norman's Gorean saga is brought to life in the Tales of Gore role-playing game and its companion world book, World of Gore. Take flight on a tarn, luxuriate in the bathhouses of Ar, pit your steel against the deadly Kuri, best your enemies and place them in your collar. Tales of Gore uses the D6 system, perfect for both new and old players. You can purchase it from Amazon, RPG Now, or Lulu.com. Ta Sada Gore!